Hello all, welcome to our second lecture in week 3. In our first discussion, we discussed black codes and Jim Crow laws that legally restricted African Americans after the Civil War. And despite the Reconstruction Amendments we discussed in week 2, Plessy versus Ferguson was a further example of that legal action. So Plessy versus Ferguson is in 1896. Homer Plessy refused to sit in a Jim Crow car. This was a test case. One of the things that they discussed was that Plessy was an Octoroon, which is a person who has 1/8 African ancestry. So the main argument of the case was that the Louisiana law that forced Homer Plessy to move to the Jim Crow car, and let me be specific, we're not even, later we'll talk about back of the bus versus front of the bus and giving up your seat for a white person, but in the railroad industry we are talking about very segregated transportation, and we're actually talking about a separate Jim Crow car, and that's what they asked Homer Plessy to move to, and he argued that violated his civil rights, that the Louisiana law that forced him to be in a Jim Crow car violated his civil rights. So the Plessy versus Ferguson ruling was a 7-1 vote. The main ruling in the case was states have a right to create laws that segregate public places. And they said that the Louisiana law implies merely a legal distinction between two races, which does not conflict with the 13th Amendment forbidding involuntary servitude, nor does it reestablish such a condition. So basically what they're saying is that you can't make an argument based on the 13th Amendment that this is an involuntary servitude because he has to ride in a separate car. But they don't really address the 14th Amendment, which has, if you remember, the Equal Protection Clause, and says that all people are required equal protection under the law. There was only one opposed. That was Justice John Marshall Harlan. He was a Kentuckian, and his family had owned slaves prior to the Civil War. But he's actually, when you guys are looking at your research papers, he's a great figure to research. He actually did a lot in civil rights justice. What he said in his dissension is the Constitution is colorblind and neither knows nor tolerates classes among citizens. In respect of civil rights, all citizens are equal before the law. The court's majority opinion, he pointed out, gave power to the states to place a condition of legal inferiority on a large body of the American citizens. So it's really important what he's saying, because he's saying two things. Is that, first of all, as I said, he's saying that all citizens are equal before the law. So that's reinforcing the 14th Amendment idea that's not really discussed in this case, that by forcing them to sit in a separate car, you're not recognizing their equal protection under the law. And he also pointed out, because another thing we're going to discuss probably in a little more limited way, unfortunately, is what comes out of Plessy is separate but equal. But separate is never equal. The Jim Crow cars are not as nice as the white cars. The Jim Crow drinking fountains are not as nice as the white drinking fountains. African Americans are made to sit in balconies at theaters because they're not thought to be as nice of seats. Same with courtrooms. There's an African American section in the courtrooms. And whatever is the lesser of the two is what African Americans are giving. I truly believe, like they'll rule in Brown versus Board of Education, that separate is inherently unequal. But when we're talking about segregation, Jim Crow laws, and Plessy versus Ferguson, not only are we talking about separate being inherently unequal, but we're talking about a group of people who did not want to spend on African American accommodations, so that they are extremely inferior to what white people were receiving. Justice Harlan also feared that the court's ruling would plant the seeds of race hate under the sanction of law. And I think that's really important, because what he's saying is that he's talking about racial hate and racism, and the fact that, again, we're talking about sanctioning those with federal law. So, as I said, what comes out of Plessy versus Ferguson is the statement that you probably have often heard, that separate but equal. And that's what they ruled. But there's no equation for that. There's no way to prove if the facilities are equal if they're separate. And they're not. I mean, you can look and see they're just not the same. So I know that was a really short lecture, but I feel like Plessy versus Ferguson is so important to the look at civil rights. And as I said, I mean, clearly we'll look at it again when we get to Brown versus the Board of Education, because that's what it's arguing against. It's arguing against the idea that separate can be equal, beyond the fact that separate never was equal during this period. It's important in conclusion because it reinforces segregation on a national level. And that's important because there are Jim Crow cars in the North, trained segregated people, and they didn't necessarily switch over in the North versus the South. This is a reinforcement that segregation is okay by our federal government and the Supreme Court. And it virtually ignores the protection of the Reconstruction Amendments beyond. I could argue it would place them back in servitude. It does not equally protect African Americans under the law. So that's my reference slide this week. As I said, there's a biography of Justice John Marshall Harlan on this list if you guys are interested in learning more about him. And some other sources about Plessy versus Ferguson. Thanks, guys. Have a great day.